Hello and welcome to Advent with the Prophets. My name's Richard Ounsworth and I'm speaking to you from Holy Cross Priory in Leicester. We thought we'd have a little series of talks on the four major prophets and how we can understand them in the light of Advent and understand Advent in the light of the prophets as well. Naturally enough, I'm going to start with the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah, I think probably the most famous of the prophets, and certainly the one that we most commonly associate with Christmas. Isaiah prophesied the coming of Emmanuel. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means, as you know, God with us. This comes from the prophet Isaiah and is quoted by St. Matthew towards the beginning of his gospel, when he explains how appropriate it is that the mother of Christ should be a virgin. And you'll have heard it said, I suppose, that the word that Isaiah uses, alma in Hebrew, parthenos in Greek, doesn't necessarily mean a virgin. And in fact, that's true. But I think what's really important about understanding Isaiah and all of the prophets in the light of Christ is the fact that a prophet can mean so much more than he knows he means. When we think about what a prophet is, we naturally enough think about telling the future. I'm going to come back more to that theme about whether prophecy is really telling the future in our second talk on the prophet Jeremiah. But certainly the prophet Isaiah has an awful lot of future tense verbs in his writing. He speaks of the future and he looks forward with hope and eagerness to God's salvation of his people. When he prophesies, however, the coming of the child called Emmanuel, it does take place within a very particular time period, a very particular crisis in the history of God's chosen people. In case you're interested, it was so-called Syro-Ephraimite crisis, in which the kingdom of Judah is under a double threat from the kingdom of Syria and the kingdom of Israel, which is this sort of twin kingdom of Judah at this time. These two kingdoms are threatening the kingdom of Judah if they don't enter into an alliance with them against Assyria. And Isaiah says, don't bother, don't listen to them, you don't need to worry. All you need to do is trust in God. And here is the proof of that. A virgin will conceive and bear a son, and his name will be called Emmanuel. And by the time that he's been weaned, this whole problem will have gone away. I am paraphrasing slightly, you understand, but you can look up the actual text for yourself. The point that he's making is within a very short period, the period of this child's birth and weaning, this problem will have gone away. There's no need to make this alliance. There's no need to do what the king is thinking of doing and go off to the Egyptians to get their help. It's all going to be fine as long as you trust in God. Now, all of this takes place in the 8th century. And Isaiah's prophecy, as the prophet himself would have understood it, is about how it's all going to be sorted out in the 8th century. So what does any of this have to do with Christ? Well, it seems very likely that the child that Isaiah is prophesying is specifically a royal child. We actually have a number of examples from ancient history of more or less exactly the same phrasing that Isaiah uses in the proclamations of royal pregnancies. So Isaiah foresees the coming of a royal child and says the birth of that child is going to be the fulfillment of God's promises and the guarantee that he will be the savior of his people. What I want to suggest to you is that that particular royal child, presumably the king's eldest son, that particular royal child was only a kind of down payment on a further fulfillment of this prophecy, a fulfillment that even Isaiah the prophet himself wouldn't have been able to put into words. He didn't know exactly what he was prophesying. Though I do believe that Isaiah knew precisely because he was a prophet, that his own words could mean more even than he understood by them. Do you remember how St. Paul talks in the first letter to the Corinthians about how we now see as in a glass darkly? And I believe that to be a prophet in the time of the Old Testament was very much like this. A prophet is given, in a certain sense, a God's eye view of reality, a God's eye view that necessarily encompasses all of time as well as all of space. But he sees it dimly. He sees it, as it were, through the mist because of the inevitable, I suppose we might say, the clouded nature of our human intellect. But nevertheless, he knows that these dim figures that he perceives in his own visions, one day they will be seen clearly, and what they portend will become truly visible to humanity. And you and I know, because we have seen Christ, and therefore we've seen the fulfillment of these prophecies, we know that his prophesying of a royal child was not just the birth of a prince in the 8th century BC, but was actually the birth of the prince, truly the Prince of Heaven, truly the Son of David, truly the Son of a Virgin. It might be true, as I began to mention and then got sidetracked about 5 minutes ago, it might be true that this word Alma or Parthenos doesn't necessarily mean a virgin, a woman who's, to be blunt about it, never had sex. It can mean that, but it can just mean a young woman. But Matthew, in his use of this prophecy, is very, very clear that there is no more possible remarkable sign that God can give than that a royal child should spring from the womb of a virgin. This prophecy is, of course, just one of the prophecies of Isaiah. There are 66 chapters in the book. There are a great many prophecies ranging across actually quite a wide historical period. Some parts of the book of Isaiah are thought by scholars not to date from the period of Isaiah himself, Isaiah of Jerusalem, as scholars like to call him, but might date to even 200 years later, very possibly. Actually, I'm thinking in particular of another of Isaiah's most famous prophecies. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him that brings good news, proclaiming the reign of God. This prophecy comes from a very different period. It's a prophecy that looks forward to the return of the people of Israel from their Babylonian exile. And the Babylonian exile was not even imagined in the time of the prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem, though he did begin to warn about some unknown kingdom coming from the east. But eventually, as you know, the people of Israel were taken into exile because they failed to listen to the message of that first prophet, Isaiah. Isaiah said, "Trust in the Lord and all will be well with you." But you would not. Those last little few words are often missed out when people quote Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 30:15, if memory serves. Don't quote me on that. But the words, "and you would not," they are there in the text. Isaiah knows that the people of Israel are not going to listen to his prophecies. He knows, he's told at the very beginning of his career, that he will preach in vain. It's all part of God's plan. And this plan of God is that eventually the people of Israel will be taken into exile, into Babylon. But they do not abandon their hope. And the hope, the confidence that despite the stubbornness of God's people, despite their refusal to listen, God would never abandon them. That theme runs through all 66 chapters of Isaiah. And so a prophet in the name of Isaiah, whoever he may have been, foresees the return from exile. And he sees this mysterious figure come running on the mountains with these beautiful feet, proclaiming the good news that God is returning from Zion. God is coming home. The people are coming home. And God and the people and the prophet, they all have beautiful feet. And this is proclaimed as good news. It's one of the few places in the Old Testament, in fact, where we get this phrase, good news. I think he uses the verb, which, in case you're interested, in the Greek is euangelizomai, from which obviously we get the word evangelist, and so on. So this prophet is seen as proclaiming the good news. He's clearly, from a Christian perspective, a forerunner of the evangelists, a forerunner of Christ himself, who is the good news. Therefore, we can see the coming of Christ, to which we look forward in Advent, as firstly, the return of God to dwell among his people, as the people longed for, when not only were they in exile, but inevitably God was absent from the Holy Land, because the temple, his dwelling place, had been destroyed. So they long for the return of God to his holy land, as well as their own return to dwell with him in that land. And the two go together. That's really the point. The people can't return from exile until God comes to dwell in his land. When does God come to dwell in his land? When he comes in the person of Jesus Christ. Christ truly is God with us, Emmanuel. He is God returned to dwell among his people. And this means that at long last, you and I can make our return from exile, because we are led back into the land by Jesus Christ himself. But what is this exile? Well, just as Isaiah of Jerusalem foresaw the birth of a prince, and only in dim shadows perceived that beyond that birth there was some much greater prince still to come, truly to be born of a virgin, so this other Isaiah, foreseeing a return from exile, knows dimly that this return from exile means so much more. It's not just about the Jewish people being allowed to go back and live in the Holy Land. It's all of God's people, the whole of humanity, being brought back to that land from which we were exiled right at the beginning, the Garden of Eden. We cast ourselves out from Eden when we sinned. And until Christ came, we were always exiles. We were always alienated from God, alienated from each other, from ourselves, and alienated from the earth which God made for us to dwell in. And of course, we still see signs of that alienation in our own society today. We see our alienation from our earth, for example, in the damage that we've done to the world by our ecological carelessness. We see our alienation from one another in the many faults in society, the many wickednesses that take place. And all of this results, of course, from humanity's alienation from God himself. That alienation has now, however, been healed. And it's been healed not because we've chosen to come to God, but because he first chose to come to us. And all we have to do is respond to that coming. So in this season of Advent, let's prepare ourselves anew to respond to the coming of Christ by going out to meet him with our hearts set on fire with joy and hope and love. As we go out to meet him, we also reconcile ourselves to our fellow human beings, because Advent and Christmas don't make any sense unless we have decided anew to reconcile ourselves to our neighbor, to love our neighbor truly as ourselves. It means also reconciling ourselves to our world, not just human beings, but the whole of this beautiful earth in which we have been granted to live. If we reconcile ourselves to that, we will once again make this world an Eden, a place of peace, a place of beauty, and a place of joy. These are the prophecies of Isaiah brought to fulfillment now in the person of Jesus Christ. This is the good news of Advent. Let us celebrate it with Isaiah and all the prophets. I wish you all a very happy Advent and a very Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.